Any illusions that campaigning in Italy in the summer of '43 was to be one of sunlit tourism had long since left the Allies. The realities, mud, rain turning to sleet and snow as the year wore on, poor and damaged infrastructure and heavy fighting meant that Churchill's hope that Italy was going to be the soft underbelly of Europe proved to be false. Generals Eisenhower and Montgomery left Italy in November '43, and the resources, the ships, the planes, the military formations followed soon after. Increasingly, Italy was seen as a secondary theatre to the Allies, and this was to bedevil them to the very end.
Liberating their own country, King Victor's forces will be an important asset.
Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies on the 8th of September 1943, but far from marking the beginning of peace, it created a chaotic and brutal era for many Italians. King Victor III had sided with the Allies, but his decision could not override the association of his throne with the old fascist regime. A sense of disillusionment continued to spread, undermining the monarchy's authority. Mussolini, the former fascist leader, had been held captive since the 25th of July. On the 12th of September, in what even Churchill described as a daring operation beyond all foresight, he was rescued by German paratroopers. Mussolini was then set up as the head of the new Italian Social Republic, also known as Republic of Salò. In reality, this was a puppet government run by the Germans, continuing the fascist regime. This greatly embittered the new Italian Civil War. Many Italians hated the fascists, but it also distorted the Germans' appreciation of how they must fight the war.
Perhaps bizarrely, delusions about Italy persisted far longer in the German mind than in the Allies. Strategically for the Germans, the Italian campaign was never quite just a supporting effort it became for the Allies after early '44. Politically, the survival of Mussolini and a fascist regime, albeit increasingly of a puppet nature, was important to the credibility of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler therefore was determined that Italy would not fall easily. This then drove how the Germans conducted their campaign. Defending Rome for as long as possible became their main effort.
The Italian resistance, known in Italy as La Resistenza, began to form. Partisans organised themselves into brigades, often named after political leaders, ideologies or fallen comrades. The resistance was not an ideologically coherent group because they included communists, liberals, Christian Democrats, monarchists and disillusioned fascists.
Prominent among the resistors was Carla Capone, also known as La Inglesina, Little English Girl, on account of her blonde hair and elegant demeanour. She wrote of her complicated relationship with the act of her first kill. It was a traumatic experience. I almost wanted to call to him, to make him turn around, but I knew he was armed. It seemed impossible that with my peaceful disposition against any form of violence, I should hold the gun, point it at him and shoot him in the back. After getting over the initial shock, especially since many of our comrades were being arrested and tortured, all our scruples were replaced by sheer determination to fight for our cause.
The Volturno was a heavily defended German defence line, and the enemy put up a stiff...
To defend Rome, the Germans developed a series of defensive lines. Not all were as well developed as they would have liked, but taken together, they were a formidable defensive belt. The Volturno and Bernhard lines were designed to slow down and channel the Allies, and they proved challenging. But eventually, under pressure, the Germans withdrew. This slightly misled the Allies, as when they approached the Gustav Line, they assumed the same thing would happen. However, the Gustav Line was the main defensive line south of Rome, and the Germans stood and fought. It took nearly 5 months of hard fighting for the Allies to break through.
The Fusiliers were heavily involved in this large-scale campaign across the entire country and theatre. When you consider the maritime and air components, this is even more impressive. The 8th and 9th Battalion Royal Fusiliers had landed at Salerno in September 1943 and served throughout the campaign. First Royal Fusiliers landed at Taranto on the 24th of September 1943. Months later, on the 6th of May 1944, Second Royal Fusiliers arrived, though advance elements had been attached to the 8th and 9th Battalions for a while. That was remarkable enough. All 4 active service battalions of the Royal Fusiliers in the same campaign and at Monte Cassino, the same battle.
That was just the Royal Fusiliers. Alongside them were battalions of the Lancashire Fusiliers and the Northumberland Fusiliers. Both Northumberlands and Lancashires were specialist infantry, providing specialist support arms, heavy machine guns, motorcycle riders, mortars and anti-tank weapons to infantry formations. However, the 2nd Lancashire Fusiliers and the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers fought as complete units.
The Warwicks did not serve as formed units in Italy, but many distinguished Warwicks did, including probably the most famous of all, General Bernard Montgomery, who commanded 8th Army until leaving in November 1943 to command the land forces component of the planned Normandy crossings.
The Italian campaign is very much a Fusilier campaign, and arguably at least the Fusilier campaign of World War II.
By mid-December, the strength and tenacity of the Germans in defence was clear to all. In the east, in 8th Army's area, every advance would be blocked at every river line, and there was no good route from the east through the Apennines to Rome. The Allies had, however, captured the clutch of airfields at Foggia, which gave them a workable, initially forward and later main operating base with which to conduct air operations in Italy, in the Balkans and eventually against Germany itself. In the west, the direct road to Rome from Naples was a narrow coastal road, bounded in the east by mountains and hills. Beyond that first river and hill line, which included the river Volturno, lay the Pontine marshes, which barred the road to Rome. The only remaining route was the Liri Valley, and lying at the junction of the river Liri and Garigliano was Monte Cassino, which was the anchor point for the Gustav Line.
Here is the Cassino Monastery, 1400-year-old home of the Benedictine order, which was turned into a fortress by the German army.
The Allied plan was to launch an attack on Monte Cassino and force the Germans to commit their reserves. They could then exploit the one clear advantage they had, which was the maritime flank, and launch an amphibious operation at Anzio. Together, this would turn the Gustav Line and open the route to Rome. This is all grand operational design. What was the fighting like for the Fusiliers?
Our progress was slow. Advance units sometimes clung to their rain-soaked positions for 30 days without relief.
Extracting the wounded from the hills was a nightmare. In the early stages, it took as long as 7 hours to carry a man from the regimental aid post to the car post, the ambulance point. During this time, the mule track up and down, which all supplies had to pass, was being continuously shelled. That journey was no lover's lane. Dead and stinking mules, wounded being carried down who were re-wounded, their bearers probably killed. Sergeant Dennis Todd, a 101-year-old 9th Battalion veteran, spoke movingly of having to wait with a fellow wounded soldier on the slopes of Monte Cassino for 24 hours. Sadly, the Fusilier died, but the memory has never left Dennis.
Opposed river crossings were a continual feature of campaigning in Italy, but perhaps not unsurprisingly for battalions that had fought in North Africa, there was little knowledge and understanding of how to conduct them. To the west of the Apennines, the 8th and 9th Battalions attempting to break out from the Salerno bridgehead on the direct line of attack to Rome, first encountered the river Volturno. At 70 metres wide, with steep overgrown banks and a fast-flowing current, with the autumn rains, this river would tax even the most modern of military engineers.
There was the usual evidence of German savagery. In the catacombs were hundreds of graves, graves of massacred civilians.
Civilians were held accountable for partisan activities, and collective punishment was common. Summary executions, torture, and the destruction of villages and homes were all used as part of this strategy.
One of the most notorious instances was the Ardeatina massacre in March 1944, taking place in the Ardeatina caves just outside of Rome. German forces executed 335 Italian civilians and political prisoners. The massacre was a direct order from Hitler in retaliation for a partisan attack that killed 33 German soldiers.
These pictures show the opening of the Allied offensive along the Gustav Line.
Against the Cassino position, the attacks began on the 17th of January with assaults across the River Garigliano by the British 10th Corps. These are the attacks in which the 8th and 9th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, took part. 10th Corps was on the left of the Allied army, and it was hoped that by attacking on the 17th, this would distract the Germans from the main attack to take place on the 20th of January by the French and US forces. And then, on the 22nd of January, Operation Shingle, the amphibious landing at Anzio, began.
Through a narrow lane clear of mines and onto beaches which had been made safe, men, transport and guns came ashore.
Constrained by the need to move troops into northwest Europe, and particularly by a shortage of landing craft, which had to leave the Mediterranean by the 5th of February, the Allies did not land in sufficient strength to overwhelm the German defenders and force them to commit their reserves to Anzio rather than to Cassino. 2 divisions were landed, but instead of striking out for Rome, the commander, General Lucas, decided to consolidate his bridgehead.
The landing was not auspicious. The commanding officer of the 9th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, was embarked in a landing ship tank with his headquarters and staff. After an uneventful crossing, the ship was attacked as they approached the harbour.
The captain and his number 1 dived under the bridge table and stayed there, leaving the commanding officer to watch the ship sail closer and closer to the harbour wall until, as he recalled, with a crunch and a groan, the prow of the ship mounted it. The captain then emerged and remarked, "Well, you've got a dry landing anyway."
At Cassino, meanwhile, the main assault had failed to break through. There was an inadequate appreciation that the Germans had sufficient reserves to defend both at Cassino and at Anzio. The German position was also a strong one. Across the entire front was the Rapido River, named for its current. Behind that was the town. Beyond that, there was a hill feature known as Hangman's Hill, and towering above it all was the fortress-like Benedictine monastery. What to do about the monastery had been a concern from the beginning. Initially, they decided to leave it untouched, but eventually, in mid-February, they decided to bomb it.
The town of Cassino had been destroyed, but the Battle of Cassino went on.
Unfortunately, what this did was allow the Germans to occupy the ruins and make the defensive position stronger. 3 battles were fought between January and March 44. 3 attempts to break through, but all failed. After the 3rd failure, General Alexander stopped all further attacks and planned for an overwhelming assault that would break the deadlock. He was aware and very conscious of the impending invasion of Normandy and the need to tie down as many German divisions as possible so they couldn't be moved to France. This required 2 months of preparation, which also included the move of an entire corps from one side of the battlefield to another. Finally, on the 11th of May, the attack was launched. Fusiliers were involved from the beginning, including, for the first time, the successful river crossing of the River Garigliano. And this time, crucially, they were able to establish a bridgehead and pass over it a Canadian armament brigade, which was then used to blunt the German counterattacks.
The 1st and 2nd Battalions Royal Fusiliers were committed to the fight for Monte Cassino in May 1944 for what turned out to be the final attack of 4. Despite their losses, the Germans held on fast, helped, it must be said, by the Allied destruction of the monastery in February of that year.
Indeed, the whole battlefield was a fiendishly complex place to fight in. The river valley was crisscrossed by numerous irrigation ditches. The town of Cassino itself was in ruins, and above all lay the steep and battle-scarred hillsides. Maintaining direction was difficult, and it was hard for units to stay aligned. In a typical action, on May the 12th, B Company of 2nd Battalion Royal Fusiliers commander, Major D.M. Simpson, was killed in crossfire from an uncleared position on the company's flank.
7 days of hard fighting followed, but on the 18th of May, a patrol from the 12th Podolian Cavalry Regiment, a Polish cavalry regiment, reached the top of the monastery and was able to raise the Polish flag. There they were met by a patrol from the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, led by Major Thomas, accompanied by his soldier servant, Fusilier Barden, who then accepted the surrender of some 57 German paratroopers.
Sir, did you hear about that young Lancashire Fusilier Jefferson? I hear his commanding officer has written him up for a Victoria Cross.
I didn't know. What happened?
His company got over that anti-tank ditch on the other side of the river, but our tanks couldn't get through. Jerry counterattacked with the Mark IV tanks, and they were taking lots of casualties. One of the company Piat teams was knocked out, so Jefferson runs forward with a Piat and takes a pot shot.
How close was he?
Well, that's the thing. Only 20 yards. He couldn't see the tank to begin with, so he stood up in the open. Jerry went wild trying to get him, but he blew the tank up. His officer commanding reckoned that he saved the company. His commanding officer reckoned that he saved the crossing. If he hadn't stopped the Panzers, our tanks would have never got across.
It's amazing stuff. I hope he gets the gong. It sounds well deserved.
So do I, sir.
This was also the end of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers fighting at Cassino. They were, as a brigade commander recognised, fought out. The Gustav Line was not completely broken by the attack on Cassino, but General Alexander had also been able to orchestrate a breakout from Anzio. Instead of the 2 divisions that Lucas had landed with, there were now 7, and the sheer weight of numbers and firepower began to tell. The promise of the original operational design, simultaneous pressure at both Cassino and Anzio, finally succeeded.
As our troops pushed north, they passed countless thousands returning to their battle-scarred homes.
Italian people suffered beyond the direct terror instigated by the German occupation. The lack of food led people to eat whatever they could find, cats, dogs, and any scraps left over by the Allies. And as it's often the case in the context of war, in Naples, a sexual economy emerged where Neapolitan women were forced to turn to prostitution just to feed their families.
The Germans continued their fighting withdrawal, but with the Allies linked up on the coast, there was no defensible position south of Rome, which was then declared an open city. What then followed is one of the more controversial episodes of the war. General Clark, the commander of the US Fifth Army, ordered General Truscott, breaking out from Anzio, to change his direction of attack. Instead of heading northeast to cut off the remnants of the German 10th Army retreating from Cassino, he ordered them to change direction to northwest so that he, General Clark, and the Americans could have a triumphal entry into Rome on the 4th of June. The consequences of that piece of folie de grandeur were felt months later in blood by the hundreds of Fusilier casualties who fell when they butted themselves up against the next major German defensive line, the Gothic Line in the north. It then took until April 45 for that line to be breached.
My name is Dennis John Todd, and I'm very proud to have served as a Royal Fusilier. I still hold dear memories of my mates I served with through Italy during World War II. Now, 80 years on, they are still very much alive in my memories. May they rest in peace.
Tutte le genti che passeranno, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E le genti che passeranno ti diranno che bel fior. E questo è il fiore del partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Questo è il fiore del partigiano, morto per la libertà. Questo è il fiore del partigiano, morto per la libertà. Questo è il fiore del partigiano, morto per la libertà.